Hello, Endeavor here. If you followed any mainstream media publication in 2021, one meme that they're trying to force relentlessly is that following the so-called insurrection at the Capitol building on January 6th, the greatest national security threat to America is allegedly white supremacist terrorism. The United States federal government has declared whatever they consider to be white supremacists to be the biggest threat to America, and the governments of Canada and the United Kingdom have followed suit with similar declarations. Anyone who's being honest with themselves knows that this is a lie. We saw months of BLM and Antifa riots raging across America last year, resulting in dozens of deaths, thousands of injuries, and billions of dollars in property damage. In contrast, the only people who died at the Capitol protest were protesters themselves, one of whom was shot by security forces. The media even tried to claim that someone had killed a police officer with a fire extinguisher who was later revealed to have just died of natural and unrelated causes, forcing many publications to retract their story. But in 2021, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is that the American regime has declared right-wingers, specifically anyone advocating the interests of people of European descent in America or around the world, to be their number one enemy. I must make it clear that I do not endorse any form of terrorism or violence, but I'm not naive either. The goal of this is to criminalize the expression of certain ideas, no matter how peacefully they are expressed. And I'd be lying if I said the increased aggression of the Biden regime isn't concerning. This rhetoric and paranoia over terrorism brings back childhood memories for me, of my first exposure to politics growing up as a kid in the 2000s. I was born in 1995. While I was only 6 at the time, I still have memory of 9/11. Though I didn't see it on the news when it happened, I do remember my mother coming home from work early and explaining to me what happened and what terrorism is, at least as well as you could for a 6-year-old. The war on terror was the first real world issue which I was conscious of growing up. My first exposure to politics that I remember was my father, whom I love very dearly, ranting about how George Bush was a Christian fundamentalist right-wing warmonger who saw the war in Iraq as his manifest destiny, and how we in liberal Canada aren't like those conservative Neanderthals in America. That and his rants about how evil religion is. Yeah, my father was also into new atheism. When Bush was re-elected in 2004, he told me that whenever he traveled, he made sure to make it a point that he wasn't one of those American nutjobs who voted for Bush, but a Canadian. I mean, his smugness was through the roof. The first explicitly political media I consumed was Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, which I came out of believing George Bush to be my 9-year-old secular mind's equivalent of Satan. You might find it strange being Canadian that my first memories of anything political were about American politics. But that'll lead into what I'm getting at a little later. When I was a young boy in the 2000s, I hated America. When I reached my pre-teens and started reading Mad magazine, I remember thinking that their cracks at George Bush were the most hilarious thing in history. My mental image of the United States I had in my adolescence was of a bunch of low IQ, bloodthirsty rednecks who would cheer jubilantly as they watched their military bomb some third world country into smithereens on Fox News. The only other thing I learned about America in elementary school was about slavery and Martin Luther King Jr. As I started becoming politically conscious in my late teens, I already could see inconsistencies in the narratives I had consumed in my youth. First of all, it was pretty clear to me that the dominant cultural narrative in America, and Canada as well, was not right-wing patriotic Christian fundamentalism, but the progressivism that came out of the 1960s. Jesus wasn't the most revered figure in America, it was MLK Jr. The biggest sin in America wasn't blasphemy, it was racism, sexism, or homophobia. And it was clear, even with a basic understanding of history provided by the mainstream, that America had been heading in a more progressive direction for decades. Likewise, I also began to wonder, what was the goal of the war in Iraq and George W. Bush, which my father used to rant about? It never became his manifest destiny like my father claimed it would. They didn't convert the Muslims in the Middle East to Christianity. Instead, they eliminated laws against homosexuality in Muslim countries, tried to get more women into positions of power, and tried to sell the Muslims more consumer products. They were trying to convert them to liberalism. And Obama was the president now. The image of the insane right-winger in America was still filled by the Tea Party, but Obama, whom the media had nothing but praise for, was continuing George Bush's foreign policy without receiving any condemnation. My perception of America, which I had impressed upon my mind by the media when I was young, and my understanding of Canada in relation to America, was the result of what I believe to be the greatest frame game in history. America is an empire, just like the British or the Roman before it. And the dominion of the American Empire extends far beyond the 50 states of the United States of America. It conquers through the breaking down of the cultures, ethnic identities, and religious morals of all nations, except for one, and converting the populations into soulless consumers in the world market. And the tool to do that is intersectional neoliberalism, or globalism as we might refer to it. While America has been the dominant military force in the world for decades, the deadliest weapon of the American empire is not its military, but its ability to indoctrinate the population of target nations through the control of media and education, and to wage political and economic blackmail against them. And it's only when that fails that they start dropping the bombs and sending in the military. The primary, though not the only, political entity through which the American empire conquers is obviously the United States. The United States historically was a nation built by Christian European settlers to the North American continent, English Protestants originally. But since the 1960s, the United States has been transformed beyond recognition into a multicultural proposition nation with looming majority-minority status for the historical white majority. And the transition has taken place under the egalitarian, universalist, individualistic creed adopted by the United States in the 1960s. The historical nation of the United States was really patient zero for the American empire's model of conquest. Now that might sound strange on its face. Did the United States destroy itself? In some ways, yes. Those in power at the time of the takeover allowed it to happen. Not under fear of death, but under fear of being called mean names by the media. So I don't want to excuse the culpability that the cowardice of the elites of American society at the time, and the cowardice of many other Western nations which they went on to conquer, played in allowing the West to be taken over by those who wished to destroy it. However, I do believe that the American empire and the political entity that's known as the United States today must be separated from the historical nation of the United States. After all, it seeks to destroy any remnants of what the United States once was. And the elites who rule over the United States today aren't loyal to that in the least. The most dominant group ruling over the American empire today are not Christians or Europeans, and they're fundamentally hostile to what America was historically. But for decades, as this process played out, the American empire wore the skin of the historic nation of the United States. That has been the face which the American empire has presented to the world. And herein lies what I believe to be the greatest frame game in history. This was a truly brilliant, albeit twisted, work of metapolitics. To take one of your greatest enemies and wear their skin, because this allowed the American empire to present a friendly face to its enemies, making them the most loyal towards it while simultaneously deflecting the disdain which America accumulated in the recent decades back onto that same enemy. The most powerful weapon in the arsenal of the American empire is its control over media. That is how they pulled this frame game off. So to understand how all this played out, we can look at famous works of media. I'm going to look at how the media has been used over the decades to shape the American consciousness and pull this frame game off. This process dates back to at least the 1940s. One of the earliest examples is the 1942 Hollywood classic Casablanca. Now, admittedly, Casablanca is a fantastic movie, I'm not denying that. But it's interesting to look at its messaging for our purposes, especially when you put it in its time. It's easy to call it a wartime propaganda film, but it's actually a lot deeper than that. The movie's about an American expat in Vichy French Morocco during World War II, who couldn't care less about the war going on around him, but who's eventually persuaded to do the right thing and join the French resistance against German occupation. It's very anecdotal for the United States at the beginning of World War II, prior to the film's release. Most Americans were more than happy to just stay out of the war, not seeing it as their fight. But eventually, those who wanted the US to enter the war won out, and they went to war. The American hero of Casablanca is played by Humphrey Bogart, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant with ancestors descended from the Mayflower. His character in the film is meant to represent America's supposedly noble entry into the conflict. After all, Humphrey Bogart is about as American as you can get. But if you look at who wrote, directed, and produced Casablanca, you'd be forgiven if you thought you were reading the guest list of a bar mitzvah. That might give you a better idea about why they were so enthusiastic about America entering the war. Another example of propaganda from this era, one which is a lot more culturally relevant today, is Captain America. The comic book superhero is supposed to embody America itself. The first issue of Captain America featured him punching the leader of Germany at the time in the face. You might think this was just wartime propaganda, but you'd be wrong, because the first issue was released in December 1940, a full year before the United States was even at war with Germany. The comic angered a lot of Americans at the time because they didn't want to enter World War II. They didn't want to send their men to die in yet another war overseas. But that was clearly the desire of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, the creators of Captain America, and Stanley Lieber, better known as Stan Lee, who made his comic book debut with Captain America issue 3. But beyond World War II, the character of Captain America has a deeper metapolitical message. He's meant to embody American patriotism. His costume and shield are red, white, and blue with stars and stripes, and he's often seen with the American flag. While his arch-enemy, the Red Skull, who is the antithesis of Captain America, is meant to embody National Socialist Germany, which is supposedly the antithesis of America. Reading through the Red Skull's origin story on Wikipedia, it's really quite absurd the lengths they went in order to drive home the point that he's evil. What this does is it characterizes American patriotism as fighting for liberal egalitarian universalism in opposition to a right-wing anti-liberal nationalistic regime, which is defined as the ultimate evil. And I need not mention the conflict between that regime and the ethnic group of the creators of Captain America. This kind of framing of patriotism post-World War II created the American equivalent of what Morgoth calls bulldog nationalism in Britain. It's a kind of liberal civic nationalism which identifies the far right as the ultimate enemy. And Hollywood, using World War II as its foundational myth, continued for decades. A perfect example is Saving Private Ryan. There's an interesting video by the YouTuber Rob Ager, who seems to be politically neutral, dissecting Steven Spielberg's use of imagery in Saving Private Ryan, and the extreme lengths he went to dehumanize Germans. Not Germans who are National Socialists, just German people in general. Like with Captain America or Casablanca, it puts the white American man up front as the hero, but beneath the surface, it's really Spielberg's own ethnic resentment being acted out. Now, I love the Indiana Jones trilogy. They were my favorite movies when I was a boy. I'm not denying that they're great films, but I must confess that Spielberg did the same thing in them that he did in Saving Private Ryan, using an all-American hero as a proxy for his own ethnic resentment. I actually came across a video by a leftist which explains how Spielberg used Indiana Jones to act out his own ethnic revenge fantasies. But being that the video was made by a leftist, he endorses them. Getting away from World War II, this kind of propaganda was also common during the Cold War. There are several pieces of media in the 80s that you can look to see how this manipulation of patriotism was sold to the American public. By then, the idea of America as a proposition nation was firmly cemented. I think the song God Bless the USA, which came out in 1984, can be seen as the patriotic anthem of neoconservatism. It was first popular in the 1980s during the Cold War, then again during the Gulf War, and once more following 9/11. It suggests that what makes America great is its supposed freedom, and the song has been used to suggest that non-liberal countries such as the USSR, Afghanistan, or Iraq are not quote-unquote free and therefore enemies. I recently saw the movie Rocky IV. It came out in 1985 during the Reagan era, and it features Rocky Balboa wearing American flag shorts, beating the commies, and showing up the Soviet Union. What could be more right-wing than that, right? Well, taking a closer look at the imagery, I actually read the metapolitical message quite differently. America is shown as a consumeristic, multi-ethnic society living in racial harmony, united by their love of freedom, blue jeans, and cheeseburgers. While the Soviets, I know they're supposed to be communists, but I couldn't help but see the portrayal of them as fascistic. Their boxing champion, the villain of the film, is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, square-jawed Herculean giant, with the Soviet officials making claims of his genetic superiority. There are guys wearing officers' uniforms everywhere, and they never once mention equality, but rather proclaim the might and state power of the Soviet Union. Come to think of it, this was the typical portrayal of the USSR by Hollywood in the 1980s. But the same dynamic was applied to other movies of the era. Devin Stack of Blackpilled made a great review of the 1980s action movie Die Hard. He shows how the movie put the hard-nosed white American cop from New York in the hero role. So the movie was made for a white conservative working-class audience who can identify with John McCain. But it's a bait and switch because they make every other white male character either evil, a moron, or an asshole, while all the non-white or female characters have positive portrayals. The target audience of the film is conservative white working class men, but its goal is to undermine any racial solidarity that could exist among them. You often hear from classic liberal civnats or these nerd culture channels who are ideologically aligned to them, that to solve America's race problem, we should just be colorblind like we were in the 80s and 90s. In reality, they aren't remembering the 80s and 90s as they actually were, they're remembering the pop culture from the 80s and the 90s. For example, during these 2 decades, black crime was far higher in America than it was in the 2010s, but Hollywood was showing an image of colorblind harmony. Which is why so many centrists and center-rightists who grew up on this pop culture are so reluctant to confront the reality of race today. Also, it's a lie when they say they're colorblind, because if you took one of their beloved childhood movies like Die Hard, and the only thing you changed was that you made John McCain a woman or a minority, the messaging would be indistinguishable from the dreaded Star Wars sequels, which they've spent hundreds of hours complaining about the woke agenda being shoved into. So even the centrists understand identity on a deeper level. Their worldview is really just the result of an earlier and more clever form of the same subversion as in the woke pop culture which they've made their careers on complaining about today. Now looking at the 2000s, during the era of the War on Terror and the forever wars in the Middle East, the media put forth a militaristic kind of American patriotism. I think of the Michael Bay Transformers films, Zero Dark 30, The Hurt Locker, and American Sniper, to name a few. The American military was portrayed as being very conservative. The characters were usually patriotic white Americans from the heartland, with a sprinkle of diversity, joining the military to do their part defending freedom from those Islamic terrorists over in the Middle East. Or in the case of Transformers, giant alien robots. They were extremely pro-military and by extension pro-war, framing support for the neoconservative foreign policy in the Middle East as patriotic. If one song embodies the faux patriotism following 9/11 which served to justify the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it'd be courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, the Angry American. It's really quite comical how over-the-top and militaristic the lyrics are. And as I mentioned earlier, the song God Bless the USA also made a comeback in this era as a tool of even more war propaganda. So, what this manipulation of American patriotism through media starting around World War II has done is generate support for the American empire and its globalist agenda among America's white conservative majority. It uses imagery of the historic nation of the United States, but it severs it from its historical basis in ethnicity, culture, and religion, and replaces it with loyalty to liberal universalism and consumer capitalism. So it garners support from the American heartland for the aggressive neoconservative foreign policy abroad, but it keeps them under the control of the regime by keeping patriotism firmly within the post-war liberal paradigm. But there was another benefit for the American empire of putting the historical face of the United States front and center. It's that it frames conservative white America for all the misdeeds of the American regime for which it has received righteous anger both at home and abroad. So this allows them to redirect the critique of Americanism against Red America, a population the regime has identified as an enemy, thus using the critique to further facilitate the regime's power structure. And again, media is how this was primarily achieved. We've already looked at media aimed at the right, so now let's look at media aimed at the left. Since the 1960s, the left has been presented through pop culture as being broadly anti-establishment. Think of the hippie movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, or various movements of the New Left. In hindsight, we can now see that the left of the era was never anti-establishment, but in reality enjoyed massive institutional support from the media, the academy, and finance. However, what I want to look at here is the supposed establishment that the regime's propaganda presented the left in opposition to. As I've mentioned, the American empire has spent decades exporting liberal egalitarian universalism across the globe as its means of control, but it's used the imagery of the historical American nation as a face. What this allowed the left to do, whose intersectional ideology is the mechanism through which the American empire dismantles target nations, is present themselves as oppositional while really just doing the bidding of the system. Because the so-called establishment was presented not as the real people in power, but the so-called white male patriarchy, which the left presented itself in opposition to. Think about figures like Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. Both were described by the left as these right-wing demagogues, when in reality, neither pushed back on the anti-white globalist agenda in any significant way. It was Richard Nixon who instituted affirmative action. Ronald Reagan amnestied millions of illegal immigrants, turning California into a blue state, and made MLK Day a federal holiday. But that didn't stop the left from likening them to that infamous former Austrian painter. I think of Alan Moore's graphic novels The Watchmen or V for Vendetta, which pushed this paranoid leftist delusion that Reagan-era conservatives were actually these closeted fascists, waiting to overthrow democracy and institute fascism. V for Vendetta suggests that Margaret Thatcher was going to turn the UK into the Fourth Reich and exterminate leftists in concentration camps. Watchmen suggests that Ronald Reagan was an imperialist hell-bent on global domination through nuclear war. Needless to say, nothing of the sort ever happened in reality. I mentioned how Steven Spielberg used American patriotism as a proxy for his own ethnic revenge fantasies in Saving Private Ryan. It's interesting when you contrast it with another Spielberg movie, E.T., where the US government is portrayed as the villain while the outsider alien is portrayed as good. Morgoth did a video on how E.T. pushes the idea to trust the outsider in opposition to the in-group, which is the polar opposite of Saving Private Ryan, which dehumanizes the out-group, in that case being Germans, to a cartoonish degree. Morgoth also made an interesting video on the film Outbreak and how it pushes distrust of authority, but it subtly uses imagery to frame that authority as white and male. Much like Die Hard, it portrays all the villains in the US government as white men, but the heroes as black, feminists, gay, or fellow whites. It was a lot more subtle back then, but when the left pushed this broadly anti-authority message through pop culture, they always made sure to portray that authority which ought to be distrusted as specifically white. Now let's look at the first 2 decades of the 21st century. What comes to your mind when you hear the words America, America fuck yeah, or someone chanting USA, USA, USA? You probably envision an overweight, block-headed redneck with an American flag and an AR-15 raving about how we need to kick terrorist ass over in the Middle East to save freedom. As I mentioned earlier, the media arm of the American empire needed to drum up phony patriotism to support its neoconservative wars at the beginning of the 21st century. But these disastrous wars were severely damaging to America's prestige on the world stage. So, those who control America needed a scapegoat to offload the blame onto. Well, they had just psyoped Red America into supporting the wars in the Middle East, so why not offload the blame onto them? Not the powers who actually made the wars happen, but those white Christians in the South. Because as anyone who was a 2000s kid knows, that's who really controls America, right? Now, for anyone who needs this to be made clear, obviously the wars in the Middle East were a terrible idea and they should have been opposed. But what I'm more interested in here is exactly what the left claimed to be opposing. The left again presented themselves as rebels against the establishment, but looking back, it really sinks in just how fake and gay this veneer of opposition and rebellion really was. The first thing that comes to my mind is the songs American Idiot and Holiday by Green Day. I'll admit, they're good songs, but I want to dissect their messages here. They're meant to protest George Bush and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's essential to understand that these songs go out of their way to frame white, Christian, conservative America as the villain. But if there's one thing to know about the people who are actually behind these wars, it's that they aren't white, they aren't Christian, and they aren't conservative. Let's just consider some of the lyrics of American Idiot. Well, maybe I'm the gay slur America. I'm not a part of a redneck agenda. Now everybody do the propaganda and sing along to the age of paranoia. Yeah, because it's not like America has been propagandized into accepting socially liberal values like the normalization of homosexuality. And it's not like they export liberalism to the world or anything. You see, it's a redneck agenda. America's going to war to spread Christianity to the world, right? Don't want to be an American idiot. One nation controlled by the media. Information age of hysteria. It's going out to idiot America. Yeah, nation controlled by the media, eh? Then I guess whoever controls the media controls America. But I doubt Billy Joel Armstrong is ever going to tell you who they are. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have a job in the music industry for very long. Information age of hysteria? Would he say the same thing about the past year of lockdowns, people wearing masks everywhere they go, and people being banned from sitting on park benches? Would he say the same thing about burning down city blocks and kneeling down to a mural of a criminal who died of a fentanyl overdose? We all know the answer to that. This stanza accurately describes America, but who it frames as the culprit is a total inversion of reality. America is a nation of hysterical idiots brainwashed by the media. But to understand the real agenda behind it all, I will remind you that it's now a country with transgendered children and schools that teach that math is racist. Not exactly how Green Day described it in 2004. If all the leftist tropes from the Bush era were wrapped into one movie, it'd probably be Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay. A film so anti-white it beggars belief. You can really tell the directors were laughing at the Gentiles when they made this one. It came out in 2008 toward the end of the Bush era after the neoconservative foreign policy and the faux patriotism following 9/11 had already been discredited, so they needed someone to offload the blame onto. The movie features basically every single stereotype of the 2000s imaginable, but it portrays any negative stereotype about non-white groups as being bigoted misconceptions with no basis in reality, while it portrays any stereotypes about white people as being accurate. The political message of the film is that America would be a peaceful, multi-ethnic, harmonious society if it weren't for white conservative America, and that is who the anger at America's tarnished reputation should be directed toward. This meme of America being driven to ruin by low IQ white Christians who supposedly run the country was also constantly pushed by Matt Stone and Trey Parker in their productions such as South Park or Team America. I specifically think of the "they took our jobs" meme created by a South Park episode. Even just the "America" meme, which was popularized in the 2000s and early 2010s, suggests this. It's the pronunciation of America in a southern accent, the region most associated with Christianity, conservatism, and racism. The meme suggests hawkish foreign policy based on the mindless jingoism of this demographic. So this is how the American empire has used its domination over media to funnel the American consciousness into two sides of a false political dialectic. But since this media is not only consumed in America, but globally, this political dialectic is exported. Being an empire that extends far beyond the United States, this frame game is also useful for maintaining the American empire's overseas territories. It is a neoliberal intersectional empire which exports this ideology as a means of control, primarily through media. But by framing America as being backward and right-wing, other subjects of the American empire can gain political standing by being more woke than Americans, i.e. being more loyal to the empire. So it's common for countries to try to prove themselves to be more progressive than the United States. Being more woke than America is essentially Canada's entire national identity at this point. If one Christian school in rural Texas says they won't allow biological males who are transgendered to enter the girls' bathroom, and the story gets picked up by the international media, Canada will make it a point of mandating that every school in Canada allow transgenders into the girls' bathrooms. They see themselves as standing in opposition to America when in reality they're really just enforcing the ideology through which the American empire controls Canada and the rest of the West. And they use the same frame game with the same narratives to take over countries and incorporate them into the American empire. America will use its domination of media to force through desired social and economic change in target countries, making them easier for the American empire to control. In these various color revolutions, the media usually frames the leader of a country as some kind of authoritarian dictator like the guy from the 40s who has since become everyone's favorite Hollywood bad guy, and they'll frame the AstroTurf protesters as fighters for freedom and democracy. Along with demands for greater economic ties to the West, these so-called movements always push for intersectional social policy as well. So they'll enlist the support of minority groups, feminists, homosexuals, or anyone that can be turned against the dominant culture. Students are usually the easiest people to brainwash into going along with these causes. America has attempted this kind of takeover in countries such as Syria, Ukraine, Egypt, and Libya, just to name a few. This is also the aim of the United States' aggression towards China, Russia, Iran, or Belarus today. It's to destroy any holdouts against liberalism. The most hilarious example of this was the 2020 protests in Thailand. Thailand moved towards closer ties with China, so America attempted to incite a fake revolution against the king. They had all these activists with English names, like one student activist who was called Penguin. They made LGBT rights and feminism main issues. They held signs in English and used English hashtags such as hashtag Free Youth and hashtag Republic of Thailand. They even had a Harry Potter themed protest where they compared the King of Thailand to Voldemort, complete with signs like "Get rid of tax eaters" or "Trans witches are witches." I shit you not. It's just as American as you can get, because this is the American empire's strategy for conquest. In the early 20th century, the Marxist revolutionary and political theorist Leon Trotsky advocated worldwide revolution of the proletariat to destroy all nations, and usher in an international classless society of the proletariat. Trotsky was a leading figure of the Russian Revolution, though he himself was not Russian. He was part of a small ethno-religious group dispersed across many countries who more often than not found themselves out of favor with the majority populations. So a worldwide workers' revolution which destroyed all national, ethnic, and religious bonds between all other groups was appealing for many of Trotsky's co-ethnics, as many of those who became Trotskyists had that in common with him. But a number of them made a change in the late 20th century. Once it became clear that this worldwide revolution was never going to happen, many former Trotskyists, surprisingly, were the ones who created the neoconservative movement, which goal was to spread liberal democracy and free market capitalism to the world, often through military force. Former Trotskyist Irving Kristol was dubbed the godfather of neoconservatism. He's also the father of present-day neoconservative analyst Bill Kristol. This may seem like a contradiction to go from being a communist revolutionary to a capitalist war hawk. But when we take into consideration their original motivation for adopting Trotskyism, the change to neoconservatism makes sense. As the past century has shown, the best system to dissolve nations, cultures, and religions is not communism, but consumeristic multicultural liberalism. Look at Eastern versus Western Europe today and the difference that 45 years of communism versus 45 years of liberalism had. And by the late 20th century, the former Trotskyists had their own ethno-state in the Middle East. So the prospect of worldwide revolution was no longer quite so appealing. Now with the American military at their disposal, it was much easier to accuse the leader of a hostile country of being a fascist, invade, and forcibly instill liberalism. But they needed some way to get the American people to go along with it. So the neoconservatives adopted this watered down and shallow version of American patriotism. It'll get those boys from the American heartland to sign up believing they're doing their part for freedom, and when things go wrong, that's who everyone will blame. And that was the greatest frame game in history. How perfect of a part did George W. Bush play for this charade? The guy was a neoliberal globalist through and through, yet he had a southern accent and said "God bless America" every now and then. Therefore, it was a piece of cake for the media to frame his disastrous policies as the unbridled aggression of the average white American, and liberal opposition to him as righteous humanitarian resistance to those wretches. This is also why there's a weird contradiction in America today that the people who the country scapegoats for all its problems and who it's run to the detriment of are the most patriotic, while the people who America literally bows down to in idolatrous worship hate the country the most. When I was young, I remember my father sanctimoniously recalling a story at work where his American colleagues made a reference to Saving Private Ryan, which he didn't get. Because he's Canadian, he doesn't watch this jingoistic American propaganda. The kind which led those red state morons to support George Bush in the war in Iraq. Yeah, American propaganda. He was fooled by the facade of apple pie and baseball nationalism. He's clueless to the real agenda behind Saving Private Ryan. And I don't think denouncing Steven Spielberg and the real animosity that he put into the film would bode quite so well for his liberal cred. He might see himself as being uniquely Canadian in opposition to those ignorant American bigots, but the fact of the matter is, his entire conception of being Canadian was formed for him by the American Empire itself. He is more Americanized than Americans. Canada was once a country with its own unique Christian and European identity. But it was taken over in 1963 after John Diefenbaker, the last real conservative prime minister Canada ever had, was forced out of office in what could be considered the American Empire's first successful color revolution. It was subsequently converted into a pluralistic proposition nation just like the United States, and it's been firmly under the control of American liberal capital ever since. The American Empire didn't conquer Canada with tanks and bombs, but with media and enterprise. Many Canadians are controlled by the American zeitgeist to this day just by telling them that by being more progressive, they are more moral and just people than those right-wing bigots south of the border. But the Iraqis or the Afghans, they're a little bit more hard-nosed. They aren't willing to give up their spirituality in exchange for McDonald's, Netflix, and Tinder. So that's when the bombs start to fall. Looking back on the so-called War on Terror, was Islamic terrorism ever really a threat to America? I don't want to downplay terrorism, but the fact of the matter is, even if you count 9/11, the number of victims of Islamic terror is dwarfed by that of the ongoing violent crime which is commonplace in almost every American city. Needless to say, it wasn't worth fighting wars in the Middle East over. But even that point is moot because Islamic extremism would never have been any concern to the West at all if the people from these incompatible cultures were never invited into the West to begin with. But that possibility was never even considered because the War on Terror was not about protecting Americans. It was about destroying any states which rivaled Israel in the region, but even deeper than that, it was to destroy a society of religious holdouts against the process of globalization, to uproot their traditions and convert the Middle East into a nihilistic society of liberal consumers, just like they've done to the West. Because that is how the American empire seeks to dominate the world. By dissolving all human categories, everything which gives life meaning, and replace it with a society of culturalist, low IQ zombies who only want to consume, to turn the world into a shopping mall. Now here's the good news. This frame game which fooled the world for decades is coming to an end. Donald Trump was the last president that could ever possibly be used as some kind of scapegoat to pin all the sins of the American empire on the white man. God knows they tried, but it became a bit of a joke when all of big tech, the MSM, and every single bank and corporation tried to paint themselves as the resistance. Now in the Biden era, it's becoming impossible for the intersectional left to present themselves as anything oppositional, now that it's clear that their ideology is officially endorsed by the elites who rule America. Every corporation in the Western world now pays tribute to LGBT Pride Month annually, and now feels need to chime in on every single progressive media outrage. The CIA, the FBI, and the United States military have declared their loyalty to wokeism. Big tech has gone so far as to ban Donald Trump from every platform, and people like Nancy Pelosi are now using phrases like whiteness to describe the supporters of the former president. And herein lies what I believe to be the most significant metapolitical victory the right can score in the coming years. The greatest frame game in history is quickly beginning to fall. The disastrous neoconservative foreign policies, the ruinous neoliberal economic policies, and the nightmare intersectional social policies, and now you can throw in the tyrannical COVID policies as well, all of them uphold the same system. And it's by doing away with this false political dialectic and identifying this system and the elites who rule over it as an ideologically unified entity that the most ground can be gained. Because the left, who have always presented themselves as oppositional, have no answer to any of this. How can they possibly claim to be oppositional when the CIA and the US Army are releasing advertisements declaring their commitment to intersectionality? The modern left's most fundamental principles are their positions on race, gender, and sexuality. But these appear a lot less like a rebellion of the oppressed and a lot more like a top-down imperialistic imposition of the elites, when the US government is boasting that the CIA has mentally ill Latina women of color plotting to assassinate Alexander Lukashenko. And just look at the propaganda the American media is now churning out. Gone are the days where they hid subtle messages in pop culture, gradually changing the psychology of the population through repeated exposure. And gone are the days where the propaganda juggled two sides of a controlled political dialectic. Now, everything is woke, with political messages as subtle as a sledgehammer. And to come full circle, you'll now even get self-declared communists like Vow shilling for the American empire's aggression overseas against non-progressive countries. Even George W. Bush is now saying that pulling the US Army out of Afghanistan will be the end of feminism in the country. What was once neoconservatism is now dropping the phony patriotism and becoming overtly leftist again. The modern intersectional left is a creation of the American empire, which is why, once it becomes clear who is in power and what their agenda really is, any critique from the left is moot. Any leftist who actually began to question the superstructure which upholds the system would be ostracized from the left immediately. So the only other option they have is just to remain in a camp which is only becoming more and more obviously an arm of the establishment. The only real opposition to the system comes from the right. Not the phony right, the actual right. And that brings me back to the beginning of this video. The liberal American empire over the decades has identified many enemies which it's targeted for destruction. In the 40s it was fascism, during the Cold War it was communism, at the beginning of this century it was Islam. Now it seems that they've openly declared war against European descended people in general, both in America and around the world. Looking back at the messaging and the propaganda of the American empire's media machine, it's almost fitting that they're now making Captain America a black woman fighting the evil white male patriarchy. The character of Captain America was originally created as a proxy to rally support against a past enemy of its creators. Now, 80 years later, the same people control Marvel today, and now they're using a different demographic in their propaganda as a proxy to rally support against their enemies today. The Biden administration today will fearmonger about the false threat of so-called white supremacist terrorism. The Attorney General Merrick Garland even called it the greatest national security threat. Obviously, it's nonsense to suggest that this is the primary source of violence in the United States. But what is a real threat to the power of the American empire is groups of people resisting the absorption into the mass consumerist blob. That's who they've always set their targets on, and that's who their targets are on today. It's fitting that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has authorized the US embassies around the world to fly the rainbow flag, because that is the flag which accurately represents the American empire and its imperialist agenda which it seeks to impose upon the world. The Star-Spangled Banner is simply a mask which has hidden the true face behind the American empire for decades, and it's time that that mask falls. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If I mentioned any pieces of culture in this video that you like, please don't lash out at me. Some of them are things I enjoyed too. By knowing the messages in them, you can immunize yourself from their negative influence and still enjoy the things that you like. If you're watching this on YouTube, please also follow me on Telegram and Odysee, because I'm not likely to be on YouTube for very much longer. And if you want to support my work with a donation, you can do that too. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavor.